What am I doing up this early? Well, isn't it obvious? It's record store day today, baby! Long day, and it's just getting started. So what is record store day, and why would anyone want to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning just to go? To answer that question is going to require a trip back into time and a bit of a history lesson. So let's turn our attention to the ancient prehistoric days of the 1990s. Yeah, that really hurt to say. And although the 90s don't seem that long ago to me, I realize that it was in fact a long time ago, and I'm slowly coming to grips with that reality. But back in the 1990s, there were changes that were happening that have affected our world and our culture ever since, especially if you listen to music. Because in the mid-1990s, the last of the big chain record stores were shuttering and closing for good. But to be honest, to still be calling them record stores at that point was a bit of an anachronism, because they hadn't sold vinyl for a very long time. Up to that point, the vast majority of music that was sold in record stores was CDs. And there were a lot of factors involved in this shift from going from vinyl to tape and then eventually to a digital medium like CDs. But the irony was the fact that CDs were a digital medium really led to not only the obsolescence of the CD, but also the obsolescence in the so-called record store. Because music on CD is a digital medium, and also because by the mid-90s, more people had access to home computers. Both of those led to basically music being very easy to pirate. It was simplicity itself to burn a copy of a CD or even individual songs from a CD. The software it took to burn music off of a CD was cheap to sometimes even free. And because it was legal to make a single copy of a CD you'd purchased, this software wasn't even illegal. Add to that the increasing access of the internet and the creation of file sharing services like LimeWire and Napster. And then suddenly, if you wanted a song, it was just a free download away. And understandably, record stores were desperate to shut all this down. But record companies didn't go after companies like Napster because they wanted the consumer to go back to purchasing CDs at a record store. They discovered a new marketing model that would make music cheaper for them to put music out, but also make a lot more money for themselves. Hence, we get streaming services. And with more and more people deciding that instead of buying individual CDs, it was better to pay a monthly fee and listen to whatever they wanted to, well, big chain record stores really didn't stand much of a chance. After that, the only real record stores that still existed were those small mom and pop stores that were still selling vinyl for people who were interested in physical media. But even they were beginning to feel the pinch because records were a niche interest and not a lot of people were interested in that form of physical media. Most people considered vinyl old-fashioned and really not worth the hassle. Plus, record companies weren't really in the business of pressing new music into vinyl. But a few people who are interested in physical media in general and vinyl records in particular decided that these independent stores needed to be saved. And so in 1997, Record Store Day was born. The purpose of Record Store Day was to bring focus to these small independent record stores that were keeping physical media alive. And Record Store Day became a really big deal for vinyl enthusiasts because there would be on that one day big record sales, and also there would be special editions of albums that would be pressed. Many of them would be like a one-time pressing where if you didn't get it at Record Store Day, you wouldn't be able to purchase it except on the secondary market for a whole heck of a lot of money. But even after all of that, vinyl was still very much a niche interest. But then came COVID-19 and the pandemic and the lockdown. And during lockdown, many people were looking for hobbies as a way to pass the time. And for some people, myself included, one of those hobbies became collecting vinyl, which is pretty ironic when you think about it, because if I had just done a sourdough starter instead, I could have saved myself so much money. But even after lockdown ended, many of us continued to collect vinyl, mostly because of the enjoyment we get from finding new albums and listening to them, but also because the culture around music has changed. Many of us learned the hard way that the promise that digital and streaming made to all of us, that for a single monthly fee we could listen to or watch anything that we wanted, was a promise that they really couldn't keep. And so this idea of physical media as a means of preserving and maintaining access to films and television and music that we enjoy has really gotten back into vogue. And also very popular musicians and bands like Taylor Swift and Metallica, who've shared their love of vinyl and their desire to put their new music out on vinyl, has brought vinyl really to the mainstream. Taylor Swift has made it a point to try to put something out every Record Store Day. And I can definitely tell you from standing in line this year that a lot of the people in that line were in fact Swifties. And that explains the why of Record Store Day. But it doesn't explain why I would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning just so I could spend hours in a lawn chair on a sidewalk outside of a record store waiting for it to open. For me, one of the big factors for getting up that early is that the vast majority of the records that are released on Record Store Day have really small print runs. And so for a lot of these albums, there may be at the most 2,000 to 3,000 copies total for this entire album. And also, a lot of these albums are Record Store Day exclusives, which means there's only one pressing and they're not going to press any more, which means that if you're not able to pick up a copy at your local record store, then the only option you get to get you a copy of this album is through the secondary market, which can be pretty expensive. And add to that the fact that my taste in music can be a bit eclectic at times. Well, that means that many of the titles that I'm really interested in for Record Store Day don't tend to have a big following, and so they don't get huge press runs. And very often, record stores may not even pick up the titles for Record Store Day. But I do have the advantage in that I know the owner of my local record store, and I order some strange titles from him sometimes, and I also let him know what titles I'm interested in for Record Store Day. And he does a really good job of picking up a copy of titles that I'm interested in. But again, because my taste in music, it can be at times eclectic, it means that there's no guarantee that the vinyls that I want are even going to be in the store. And if they are, there may be only one copy. And that's why I have to be in line early, because it only takes one person in line in front of me with similar taste to guarantee that many of the albums I'm looking for, I'm not going to be able to get. And I know right now you might be thinking, well, Brian, if your tastes aren't really all that peculiar, what are the odds that somebody else is going to be in line in front of you to pick up those albums? And I can understand that logic, and I appreciate it. However, strangely enough, this year gives me the perfect illustration as to why getting up early and getting into line as soon as possible is so critical for Record Store Day. So I get to the record store somewhere between 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, but I had no illusions that I was going to be the absolute first in line, because Record Store Day ain't no joke. There are some people who spend the entire night out in front of the record store waiting for it to open. In fact, you can always tell the front of a line for Record Store Day because there are no lawn chairs. There are tents. In fact, I've heard a story about a record store in Barboursville, which is a few miles away, where they had people who lined up the day before record store day at like 3:30 in the afternoon, waiting for the next day and to get in. That's what they had to do to be the first in line. And so even though I got there before 4 o'clock, I wasn't the first in line, or the 5th, or the 10th. And so I took my place at the end of the line and put out my deck chair, and about 10 to 15 minutes later, someone got behind me and put out his deck chair. And by 5 o'clock, there was a decent line behind us. And by the time it was 7:30, which was 30 minutes before the record store was going to open for record store day, that line went completely down the street, around the corner, and down the block from there. And then finally, when the doors opened and they were letting people in for record store day, and we're all folding up our lawn chairs and getting ready to walk into the store, I heard the gentleman behind me, the person who came in like 10 minutes after I did, and he was talking to some people behind him, and they were having a discussion about what they were wanting to get for record store day. And the gentleman behind me, I noticed, had a British accent, and he mentioned how he didn't normally shop at this particular record store, but there were some titles that were at this record store that weren't at the Barboursville store where he normally shops. And I will never forget, for as long as I live, that moment when the gentleman talking to the people behind him said, "Well, I don't suspect that the record store is going to carry many copies of the titles that I'm interested in, but I don't suppose very many people from around here are going to be that interested in Goth music." And at that moment, all I could do was just stand there and shake my head and think to myself, dude, I am not the person you want standing in front of you in line. But had I decided to sleep in instead, or had even been 15 minutes late to getting into line, that gentleman would have been the one in front of me, and I would have been the one who went home empty-handed. So is it important to get up as early as possible and get into line for record store day? You bet your ass it is. And so the big question now is, was getting up at 3 o'clock really worth it? Was I able to get everything that I wanted at this year's record store day? And I will say I was able to get everything that I had planned to get. There were a lot of albums on the list this year that piqued my interest, and if I had unlimited space and unlimited funds, I probably would have bought a lot more albums. But I don't have unlimited space or unlimited funds, and I don't suppose you do either. So it's understandable that I would have to pick and choose what I wanted. But fortunately, everything that I had on my list, after I narrowed everything down, I was able to get. And here's the stack. So let's see what I got. Now, this first one, which is a 7-inch, I have to admit it wasn't originally on my list, but I saw it on the shelf and decided, what the heck, I will go ahead and pick it up. And that's The Last Dinner Party Live from the Pyre 2025. I discovered The Last Dinner Party rather recently. I really like their music, and so I own both of their LPs, and this is 2 songs off a live performance of songs that are on their latest LP, and I thought I'd like to have it and hear what they sound like live, and so here we are. Now this next album, of course, I love me some goth music, so I had to pick it up. Sisters of Mercy, First, Last, and Always. And right now you might be thinking, Brian, you don't own a copy of Sisters of Mercy, First, Last, and Always? How in the hell do you call yourself a fan of goth music if you don't have this seminal album? Well, actually, I do have a copy of this album. In fact, I happen to have 2 copies of it. However, this version, for Record Store Day 2026, is a reproduction of the Japanese pressing of this album. And the difference between the Japanese pressing and the one we're more familiar with is, although the track listing is pretty much the same, the way the songs were arranged and mixed are different. And so a lot of these songs sound different than they do on the original pressing that we all know and love. And so this is a different album and one that I really wanted to check out. Now, if you remember my story, of course, you're probably wondering, did the British guy behind me miss out on this copy? Well, he did want a copy of it, and fortunately, in this case, there were 2 copies, and so he didn't miss out on this pressing. But he did miss out on this one. Ixmal Deutschland, Peel Sessions. Now, if you're not familiar with John Peel, he was a British DJ who had this radio show, and he would have these long sit-down interviews with bands, and they would perform their music live in the studio. And some of the bands that he interviewed were alternative, they were post-punk bands, they were bands that maybe weren't that popular, but John Peel saw something in them, and so brought them into the studio and, in a real sense, introduced them to the world. And a lot of these live performances have been captured on vinyl, and this Peel session by Ich Mal Deutschland is the latest. And I was really happy to get my hands on this because there was only one copy, and the British guy behind me really wished he'd have gotten in line 15 minutes earlier. And next on my list, the Jesus and Mary Chain, Some Candy Talking. The 40th anniversary of this EP, repressing, is a classic and very difficult to get your hands on, unless, of course, you have one of the old pressings or you were in line for record store day. And while we're on the topic of remixes and reissues, we have the Cult's Weapon of Choice, which is sort of a proto-album, a previous version of their main release, Choice of Weapon. So the songs on here, there are some songs that they took off of this album to put on Choice of Weapon, others they didn't keep, and they created new songs. But this is not only a look behind the curtain as to what eventually became Choice of Weapon, but it's also got some unreleased tracks that didn't make the cut, but definitely worth listening to. And another remix I've been looking forward to has been the Wax Trax remixes of My Life with a Thrill Kill Cult, they called Sinister Whispers. And so these are all remixes of songs done by Wax Trax from 1987 to 1991. This is a double album set. And I was really looking forward to getting my hands on this, and I was glad that there was a copy available for me. And on the subject of post-punk, I was able to get my hands on a copy of Wire's Read and Burn 3. If you've never heard of the band Wire, they were, in a real sense, pioneers when it came to post-punk movement. When you listen to their music, you can definitely hear the punk roots in it, but you can also hear where they were branching away from it and taking the music in places it had never been before. Through their music, Wire was able to lay a foundation where post-punk music built upon and grew from there. And they also inspired bands like Susie and the Banshees and The Cure, and even Kurt Cobain of Nirvana. And I've been a big fan of Wire ever since I started listening to their music, and can't wait to listen to this. And while I was at Record Store Day, I happened to pick up a little piece of lost history. This is an untitled album by the band Slint. This is also a proto-album, which would eventually get remixed and repackaged and eventually would turn into Spiderwebs, which was Slint's only real album. Like Joy Division, Slint as a band weren't around for very long, but their music was influential and inspired a lot of bands. Unlike Joy Division, however, most people don't really know about Slint, and so I was extremely excited that there was a copy of this available, and I am very proud to have this piece of lost history. Also on the subject of remixes, but also eclectic music that not everybody has heard of, I got the 2-album Klaus Nomi remix bundle. As an artist, Klaus Nomi defies categorization. For many years, Klaus Nomi was a fixture of the art community in New York City, and he was a part of that big Greenwich movement of art. And to this day, there has never been an artist like Klaus Nomi, and I doubt that there ever will. I doubt I could even explain to you what he was as a performer, and if I were able to encapsulate the essence of Klaus Nomi in words, if I did that, I doubt you would even believe me. So if you're curious, definitely check him out, but strap in because you are not ready. And finally, because I'm a big fan of punk music, especially horror punk, I went and picked up a copy of the Misfits' Famous Monsters. This vinyl's been out of print for a pretty long time. I've been a big fan of this album since I first heard Saturday Night, which is probably my favorite track on the whole album. But I was really excited to get my hands on this album, which leads me to one final album I want to show you, which technically isn't a Record Store Day purchase, but I would call it Record Store Day adjacent. And it is tied into this album, because even though I did get up early to stand in line at Record Store Day to pick up some albums for myself, I was also in line to pick up an album for a friend of mine. There was just one particular album that he was interested in, and it was one of those obscure albums that there was only going to be one copy available. And since he's a good friend, I just told him, hey, look, I know I'm going to be getting up early regardless. And so there's no point in the both of us having to do that. So why don't I just pick up the album for you and I'll bring it to you. Because of that, he was able to sleep in. And because I was able to get the album that he wanted, I was able to trade that album for this Misfits American Psycho 2-album a limited edition set. This is number 2004 of 3000 printed. It was part of a record club, so you had to be a part of the record club to even get this album. Along with the 2 albums that are a special limited edition colored vinyl. Comes with a poster and a turntable mat. And the cover glows in the dark. So yeah, not a bad trade. Just to be clear, I'm not under some delusion that this video will somehow explain perfectly to everyone why it is that I got up so early in the morning to go stand in a line and buy records. I'm not even sure such a video would even be possible. In fact, I'm pretty sure that anyone who thinks I was crazy for doing it are going to walk away from this video absolutely sure of it. Which I suppose is the main reason why I did in fact go, because while I was out there sitting on that sidewalk, on that lawn chair, there were more and more people gathering on the sidewalk with me. And I didn't have to explain to a single one of them why I was out there, because they were out there for the same reason. It's like the old saying goes, to those who don't understand, no explanation is possible. To those who do understand, no explanation is necessary. And perhaps there's a little bit of a life lesson in all this. Maybe it's a waste of time trying to explain yourself to people who don't get you and aren't interested in trying. Maybe your time is better spent looking for your tribe. There's probably more I could say about this, but I don't really have the time right now because I've got to get home and get ready, because tonight I'm heading up to Huntington to go see the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Why would I drive all the way to Huntington to watch a movie, and a weird one at that? Well, I could take the time to explain it, but there's really no need, because tonight in Huntington, there's going to be a whole theater full of people that I won't have to.